Ladies and gentlemen, I wish I had better news for you, but we are facing a storm that most of us have feared. A mandatory evacuation order is hereby called for all of the parish of Orleans.
Sunday morning in New Orleans, the National Weather Service issued a bulletin predicting a hurricane along the Gulf Coast of what it called unprecedented strength. The area will be uninhabitable for weeks, the bulletin predicted, and it went on to say, human suffering incredible by modern standards.
The National Weather Service told us, we're scared for you. We're deeply scared for you. Now, this is government officials. They don't use those words.
In the wake of 9/11, the newly created Department of Homeland Security had come up with a detailed plan for responding to such disasters. Nearly 500 pages long, it claimed to ensure seamless integration in the event of a national emergency of the federal government and local and state authorities.
Before we get started, I want to very briefly introduce Michael Jackson.
At noon that Sunday, Michael Brown, the director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, presided over a teleconference with state, local, and federal officials.
We're going to move fast, we're going to move quick, and we're going to do whatever it takes to help disaster victims.
President Bush joined the briefing from his home in Texas.
I want to assure the folks at the state level that we are fully prepared to not only help you during the storm, but we will move in whatever resources and assets we have at our disposal.
Words like quick and fast, resources and assets sound reassuring, but it now appears that officials from President Bush on down to the local level were often using words that signified different things to different people. Even terms like mandatory evacuation.
And folks, we've said it all morning, we will say it again. If you can get out of town, you need to get out of town.
28% of the population of the city of New Orleans is below the poverty line. And poor people tend to be less well informed and tend to be less mobile, not to have cars to get out.
And so many of those who wanted to leave New Orleans but couldn't headed for the city's Superdome. By 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon, some 10,000 people had already gathered there.
We've been out here since 9 o'clock. They need to organize this crowd.
Katrina blew through New Orleans early Monday morning, a Category 4 hurricane with winds of up to 125 miles an hour. The mayor and some of his staff had set up a command center in the Hyatt Hotel beside the Superdome.
The only communication we had was a laptop that we brought, and it had a wireless broadband card that worked all the way up into the Hyatt. So the mayor and the chief and all of us were getting our information via this little laptop. Finally, the internet feed goes out.
It was one in a series of communications breakdowns that would contribute to untold suffering and a still untallied number of deaths. At 8:14 Central Time, the National Weather Service issued a bulletin reading, "Flash flood warning. A levee breach occurred along the Industrial Canal at Tennessee Street." The problem was that by the time that bulletin went out, the hurricane had been battering the city for hours. Electricity and phones were out, so most people neither saw nor heard the warning. Officials in Washington seemed totally oblivious to the bulletin.
Police operator 16.
But they didn't need any bulletins in the lower 9th Ward and St. Bernard's Parish just east of the city. There, 20-foot waves of water obliterated most of the landscape in just a couple of hours.
We can project right now at 11:50, it has now left the state of Louisiana.
With the storm gone, it was up to local officials to go and assess what damage their communities had suffered.
For 48 to 60 hours after the storm makes landfall, each local community needs to be able to sustain itself. Then we can expect state and federal resources to begin to flow in.
Is that someone in the car?
Few ventured out, but two who did were among the first to sound the alarm on a new disaster.
About 2 or 3 in the afternoon, when the winds were still pretty strong, two of my colleagues, an editor and an art critic, took their bicycles and rode out to the lakefront to where they lived. and witnessed firsthand the water gushing through the breach in the levee and their own neighborhoods filling up like a bathtub.
This second breach was on the west side of the city, directly across from the eastern side where the morning breach had been reported by the National Weather Service. But most of the officials who were running the relief effort were either stuck in the downtown Hyatt Hotel, in the state capitol at Baton Rouge, or out of the state altogether. The governor, though, was optimistic.
We did report to Air Force One, and the president has signed all the declarations of emergency that we need to release the financial capacity of the federal government to help Louisiana people.
Once the president landed in Arizona, he mentioned the hurricane in a speech devoted to Medicare, but in an odd foreshadowing of the disconnect that would plague the administration for the next several days, he made a reference to what sounded like a totally irrelevant conversation he had just had with his Director of Homeland Security.
I said, are you working with the governor? He said, you bet we are. That's the most effective way to do things, is to work with the state and local authorities. There are more resources that will be available.
But the topic they were discussing was immigration reform, not hurricane resources.
Pretty much it for Katrina.
The first images out did not show a city submerged. Storm damage? Lots of it, maybe more than usual, but nothing really remarkable except perhaps for the torn skin on the roof of the Superdome.
Once the storm passed through on Monday evening, nobody was let out of the dome still. They were still had to stay within the dome areas.
Okay, ma'am. Is there any way you can get to the roof if need be?
Other parts of the city, of course, were flooding, and evacuees from the rising water headed to the only building that had been designated a shelter of last resort, the Superdome. Deputy Police Superintendent Lonnie Swain spent Monday and the following 6 days there.
We lost power in the dome the morning of the storm, about 6:30 a.m. We had backup generators that were able to provide limited lighting. But again, with those conditions, limited lighting, no air conditioning, and a water system that was no longer working. Restroom facilities were unavailable to those people. We had limited food, limited water as well.
About 80 miles to the west in Baton Rouge, state and federal officials had been watching the storm from the safety of the State Emergency Operations Center. They were cautiously optimistic the recovery would be on track. But as evening fell, according to her office, Governor Blanco told the president, "I need everything you've got."
Director Brown, I hope you will tell President Bush how much we appreciate it. These are the times that really count, to know that our federal government will step in and give us the kind of assistance that we need and are in desperate need of.
What I've seen here today is a team that is very tight-knit, working closely together, being very professional, doing, and in my humble opinion, making the right calls.
The federal government, though, was waiting for specific requests from the storm front. By asking for everything you've got, Governor Blanco was providing no guidance whatsoever. Another breakdown in communication.
It's just unreal, and all of a sudden you're saying, guys, we're trapped. And not only we're trapped, hundreds of cell towers have gone out. No power. No way to do anything about it. That's what people were missing in here. They kept thinking someone else was going to come. Obviously there was a dry place. Obviously some place had power. Obviously no, and no. There was none of that.
This entire community completely underwater.
And when the first aerial showing a much more expansive view of the area came in that evening, the devastation was quite visible to anyone who was watching.
The actual downtown area seemed to be with the least flooding. Where we started to see some major flooding was, again, when we started working west from downtown and north towards the Pontchartrain. It got substantially worse.
It was very frustrating to know what we knew and see that the story wasn't getting told to the nation and to the world.
And do you think the mayor at that point understood that?
I think he did, yes.
Did the governor?
Less so. She's in a remote location, and the communication between the state and local levels were not what they should have been.
And what about the national government?
I think the national government, from what I can see, was oblivious.
The airport was closed. Those with cars had already left. The city needed buses, hundreds, maybe thousands of buses.
Were you